When I pulled into my driveway after a week-long fishing trip in Montana, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn. There was a 6-foot wooden fence, ugly, uneven, and slapped together with crooked nails blocking me from parking in my own driveway. I slammed the truck door and just stood there staring at it. My name's Carter Briggs, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years. Never once had an issue. I mow my lawn, pay my dues, and keep to myself. But apparently, while I was out trying to catch trout, the HOA decided to lose its damn mind. And by the HOA, I mean Lorraine Dover, she's the president. Has been for the last 3 years, ever since she strong-armed her way in after the previous guy moved to Arizona. You know the type 50-something, bob haircut, clipboard glued to her hand, and a permanent squint like she's sniffing something sour. Lorraine lives 3 houses down and has hated my boat trailer since the day I parked it on the side of my house. I knew this fence had her fingerprints all over it. I walked across the street to my neighbor, Jerry, who was watering his rose bushes. "Jerry, what the hell happened here?" He shut off the hose and sighed. "Carter, man, Lorraine had contractors out here 3 days ago. Said the HOA voted to reclaim easement space because your driveway extended 6 inches past the property line. Nobody actually saw a vote happen, but next thing we know, bam, fence. She fenced me out of my own house. Yup. Unbelievable, I didn't even unpack." I marched straight to Lorraine's front door and knocked like I meant it. She opened with that same smug look she always had when she was about to quote a made-up HOA clause. "Well, well," she said, arms crossed, "back from your little fishing trip. I hope you understand the fence is for the good of the community. Your driveway has been violating code for years. You built a structure on my property without permission." "No, Carter, I built it on HOA-regulated land. You've been using community easement space illegally. We held an emergency vote. It passed. Show me the vote. Show me the minutes. They're being processed? Right." I turned and left before I said something I'd regret, but I wasn't done, not even close. Back home, I pulled out the property survey I got when I bought the place. My lot line was clear, and that fence, it wasn't on HOA land. It was smack in the middle of my driveway on my legal property. Lorraine had just committed trespassing, possibly even vandalism, and I was going to prove it. I spent that night printing documents, marking measurements, and calling a buddy of mine, Lance, a county zoning officer who owed me a favor. This wasn't just about getting my driveway back. It was about finally putting an end to Lorraine's reign of terror. By sunrise, I had measurements marked in red ink, a fresh copy of the county plat map, and a hot cup of black coffee steaming beside a folder labeled Evidence. The fence Lorraine's crew had thrown up sliced directly through my registered boundary. Not only that, but I had a building permit from 2 years ago that included the driveway extension fully approved by the city. That fence wasn't just petty. It was illegal. I met Lance in the courthouse parking lot before his shift started. He stepped out of his truck with his usual unbothered energy, ball cap pulled low, clipboard in hand. "Tell me this is the kind of HOA nonsense that ends in someone being arrested," he said. I handed him the survey packet. "You tell me." "They built a permanent structure across my private property without notice. No variance request, no permits, no due process." Lance flipped through the pages, eyebrows climbing higher with each one. "Well, this is a mess. And a criminal one at that." He walked the property line with me later that morning, GPS unit in hand. A bright orange string marked the boundary. The fence cut across it by nearly 2 feet. I took photos from every angle while he planted a small flag where the legal easement ended. He pulled out his phone. "I need to report this to the Code Enforcement Division. This isn't a gray area. This is textbook encroachment." An hour later, a city inspector named Rena showed up. She wore steel toe boots and a fireproof jacket, no clipboard, just a tablet and a badge. She didn't waste time with small talk. Why wasn't the HOA required to file a permit for this construction? "They didn't file anything," I said. Then they built a fence on privately owned land without municipal approval and without consent from the property owner. Exactly. She took several photos with her tablet, measured the posts, and checked for utilities. Then she turned to me. Consider this an active case. The city's going to issue a removal order. If they don't comply, we escalate, and if anyone threatens you, call the sheriff directly. I didn't wait for Lorraine to come to me. I took the fight to her. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood started its evening dog walk routine, I wheeled a whiteboard out onto my front lawn. On it, I taped a blown-up map of the neighborhood, highlighted my property boundaries, and layered in the fence line with bright red tape. I added a bold header across the top. Illegal construction by your HOA president. Neighbors gathered fast. Some brought lawn chairs. Others had questions. I didn't need to convince them. They saw the insanity for themselves. What kind of HOA builds a fence in front of someone's garage? Asked a nurse named Denise from 3 doors down. Lorraine didn't even ask us about a vote, said Mr. Kaplan, who lived on the corner. She just said it was already decided. I nodded, because it never happened. There was no vote, and now the city's involved. As if summoned by outrage, Lorraine came marching down the sidewalk in navy slacks and a floral blouse that clashed with her expression. This is defamation, she snapped. You're making a public scene with incomplete information. Then complete it, I said, stepping aside. Show us the vote. Show us one legal document saying you had the authority to build anything here. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Then she tried a different tactic. The board authorized it. Which board members? I asked. She flinched. Because I spoke to Alan this morning, I continued. He said he didn't know anything about it, and Rebecca's been out of town for 2 weeks. That leaves you. This is an internal matter. You're violating HOA protocol by involving the city. Wrong again. You violated state law when you ordered construction on private property without permission. That's called trespassing. And since you hired unlicensed labor, I never said that. I have photos, no license plates. No permits posted, no safety vests, just 3 guys with hammers and plywood. Want to tell everyone who paid them? She turned bright red but said nothing. That night, I filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office. I included the survey, Lance's documentation, Rena's inspection report, and photos of the fence with timestamps. They opened an investigation within 24 hours. By Friday morning, a city contractor arrived with bolt cutters, a reciprocating saw, and a permit to dismantle the structure. I watched from my porch as the fence came down, piece by piece in full view of the neighborhood. Lorraine stormed out of her house halfway through and started yelling at the contractor. You can't do this. This is private HOA property. He didn't even look at her. Talk to the city. I'm under orders. The last panel hit the ground with a satisfying thud. The contractor handed me a clipboard. I signed to confirm the removal, and he left the debris stacked neatly along the sidewalk. Lorraine would be fined for that too illegal dumping on city property, but I wasn't done. That weekend, I called an emergency community meeting. Not in some stuffy clubhouse, but in my backyard. I set up a projector and served lemonade. People showed up with folding chairs and clipboards. Even Alan and Rebecca came, both looking blindsided. I played a slideshow. First slide, photos of the fence. Second slide, property map with highlighted lines. Third slide, city violation notice. Fourth slide. A timeline of Lorraine's decisions over the past year, including her bypassing votes, issuing unapproved fines, and threatening homeowners over minor violations. This isn't just about a fence, I said. This is about how one person hijacked our community. She made decisions in secret, ignored procedure, and spent our dues without consent. Alan stood up. We need to audit the finances, Rebecca nodded. We also need a special election. Immediately, the crowd murmured in agreement. Lorraine didn't attend, but her car was parked outside and her blinds were wide open. She saw everything. We collected signatures that night enough to trigger a recall vote under the bylaws, but the biggest blow came on Monday. The sheriff's office called to inform me that Lorraine was being charged with criminal trespass and unlicensed contracting. Apparently, the workers she hired had already been fined in a different county for illegal construction. She'd paid them under the table using HOA funds. The city froze the HOA account pending financial review. At the next board meeting, Lorraine didn't even show up. Alan opened the meeting with a motion to remove her as president, effective immediately. The vote passed unanimously. Her reign was over, and my driveway. Wide open, clean, and fence-free. But more importantly, the neighborhood woke up. People asked questions. They got involved. We rewrote the bylaws to require member votes for any structural change. We added term limits. We mandated transparency. Lorraine's name became a punchline, and me. I went back to fishing. But next time, I'll have a camera on the driveway, just in case someone else gets any bright ideas. On Tuesday morning, I got a call from a woman identifying herself as Detective Marissa Hale with the county's Financial Crimes Division. Her tone was calm but clipped, the kind you don't ignore. She asked if I could come down to the station that afternoon to give a formal statement not about the fence, but about the HOA's finances. I agreed, grabbed my binder of records, and made the drive. The detective met me in a small interview room where she laid out a few files of her own. "Mr. Briggs, I understand you were involved in a recent dispute with your HOA president, Lorraine Dover," she said. I nodded. "That's right. She authorized illegal construction on my property. I filed a complaint. The city's already enforced removal." She gave a slight motion toward her folder. "We're aware, but what you may not know is that during the course of our investigation into her use of HOA funds for that fence, we discovered a number of unusual withdrawals over the past year. Cash payments made to unlicensed contractors, checks written to companies that don't exist, and most recently, a wire transfer to a personal account in another state." I raised an eyebrow. "You're saying she's been embezzling?" At this point, that's one of several possibilities. "We've also found evidence suggesting she altered HOA meeting minutes and recorded votes that never occurred." She turned to face me more directly. "You mentioned during the community meeting that you had a timeline of her decisions. Would you be willing to provide that to us formally?" I handed over a printout of the same presentation I'd shown the neighborhood. She flipped through it quickly, then paused. "This," she said, tapping a slide detailing a vendor payment for landscaping upgrades. "This payment to a company called Green Arbor Solutions. Did you ever see any landscaping upgrades?" "Nope, not a single tree planted or bush trimmed." "That company doesn't even have a website." She wrote something down in her notebook. "That's consistent with two other reports we've received. We believe Green Arbor Solutions may be a shell company. Possibly something she set up herself or through a relative." I leaned back in the chair, letting that sink in. "You think she's been laundering HOA money?" "Possibly." "If that's the case, she's looking at felony charges, wire fraud, misappropriation of funds, and potentially tax evasion." I left the station an hour later with a copy of my statement and a reassurance that more subpoenas were already in motion. As I got back in my truck, I noticed a car parked across the lot, a black sedan with tinted windows. Inside sat Lorraine, arms crossed, staring straight ahead like she couldn't believe gravity still worked. By Thursday, the story had cracked wide open. A journalist from the local paper showed up at my door asking for comment. She'd gotten wind of the investigation and wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak on the record. After double-checking with Detective Hale, I agreed, but only if she kept it focused on the structural abuse of power, not just the salacious details. The article dropped the next morning with the headline, "HOA President Under Investigation for Financial Misconduct After Illegal Construction Scandal." Lorraine's name was front and center, along with a photo of her walking out of the HOA office, looking like someone had just canceled Christmas. Within hours, the neighborhood group chat, which I'd previously ignored, lit up like a bonfire. Screenshots of bank statements, late fee notices, and suspicious charges poured in from residents who'd been afraid to speak up before. One elderly woman, Mrs. Langford, revealed she'd been fined over 24 times for non-compliant mailbox height, all within a 3-month span. Another neighbor, a single father named Miguel, showed us a bill for a so-called community beautification fee that no one had ever approved. We compiled everything into a shared folder and sent it straight to the district attorney's office. That weekend, a uniformed officer and 2 plainclothes detectives arrived at Lorraine's home with a search warrant. She didn't answer the door right away, but after a few minutes, they entered with a locksmith and began collecting boxes of documents and electronics. Half the neighborhood watched from their porches in silence. It was surreal. The woman who once strutted around issuing citations for wind chimes and mismatched flower pots was now being led out of her home with her laptop under one arm and a deputy escorting her to a cruiser. I didn't celebrate, not outwardly. But I did call my brother, who worked for a small law firm downtown, and asked him to help me draft a motion to formally dissolve the HOA's current board pending financial audit results. He called me back the next morning. There's a clause in your HOA charter that allows for emergency reformation if a majority of the board is found to be in violation of fiduciary duty, he said. Since 2 of the remaining members have already resigned and the 3rd is under investigation, you're clear to file. We submitted it that afternoon with a petition signed by over 2/3 of the homeowners. No one objected. In fact, people started showing up at my house offering to help. Jerry lent me his folding tables. Denise brought over a stack of old bylaws and a red pen. Even Kaplan, the quiet retiree from the corner, volunteered to run the next meeting. We weren't just cleaning up a mess. We were resetting the foundation. Meanwhile, the city released their final report on the fence incident. It included a breakdown of the costs incurred by the illegal construction, the code violations committed, and a list of homeowners likely to be entitled to restitution. My name was at the top. The city planned to recoup the funds by seizing assets from the HOA's frozen account or, if necessary, filing civil action against Lorraine personally. But the most shocking revelation came from a forensic accountant assigned to the case. He discovered that Lorraine had been collecting administrative fees for nearly every transaction processed through the HOA fines, dues, even maintenance requests. These fees were quietly routed through a third-party invoice processor registered to an address in another state. One that turned out to be owned by her niece. They'd been siphoning funds for nearly 18 months. The DA's office moved quickly. A grand jury was convened, and within a week, Lorraine was officially indicted on 5 felony counts, including fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and unauthorized use of public funds. She was released on bail but ordered to surrender her passport and appear in court the following month. In the meantime, our neighborhood did something I never thought I'd see. We held a block party. Not a celebration of Lorraine's downfall, but a quiet, symbolic restart. People brought potluck dishes, kids played in the yards again, and for the first time in a long while, no one was measuring grass height or counting garden gnomes. I stood near the grill, flipping burgers, when Miguel walked over and set a beer on the table beside me. "Never thought I'd say this," he said, "but thanks for going fishing," I laughed. "Yeah, well, I didn't expect to come back to an HOA dictatorship," he nodded toward the crowd. "You didn't just fix it. You taught us how to fight back." The new board was formed 2 weeks later, made up entirely of volunteers who pledged transparency and accountability. We rewrote the bylaws from the ground up, removed the ability for a single person to authorize expenditures, and created a rotating audit committee to review the books every quarter. No more secret votes, no more fake companies, no more unchecked power. Lorraine's trial was scheduled for the following spring, And while the legal process played out, the neighborhood slowly returned to something that felt like a community again. I never reinstalled the boat trailer, didn't need to. The message had already been carved in wood, dismantled by the city and broadcast across every lawn in the subdivision. No one fences in this neighborhood, not without consequences. 2 weeks before Lorraine's trial, I was called back to the county building not for questioning, but to deliver an affidavit confirming the chain of events leading up to her arrest. The district attorney was building a rock-solid case, and I was one of the key witnesses. I'd expected the visit to be routine, just paperwork and a quick chat with the prosecutor. What I didn't expect was to be ushered into a private conference room where 2 federal agents from the Office of the Inspector General were already seated. The taller one introduced himself as Agent Kessler. The other, Agent Ruiz, nodded and opened a file folder thick with printed emails, invoices, and flagged bank transactions. "This is no longer just a local matter," Kessler said. "We've identified multiple financial transfers from your HOA's account into shell entities tied to similar misconduct in 3 other counties. Lorraine Dover's name appears in all of them." I leaned forward. "You're saying this wasn't just a one-time abuse of power?" "No," Ruiz said, flipping to a page with a spreadsheet. "This was a pattern. She embedded herself into HOA boards, manipulated elections, and funneled money into fake vendors. In one case, she used the funds to purchase real estate under a trust registered to a fictitious name. And no one caught her before now. She moved frequently," Kessler said. "Once suspicion built, she'd resign and relocate. What happened here finally gave us enough to dig deeper. Your documentation, especially the timestamps and property maps, gave us jurisdictional leverage. Back home, I tried to process what I'd just heard. Lorraine hadn't just been a power-tripping neighborhood tyrant, she'd been running a small-scale racket, exploiting the trust of communities and draining their budgets under a veil of bureaucratic authority. We'd thought we'd pulled back a rotten board plank. Turned out we'd exposed the entire foundation. Court proceedings moved quickly after that. With federal oversight now involved, Lorraine's legal team scrambled to negotiate a plea. The community watched from afar as she was denied house arrest and placed under pre-trial detention for violating a gag order by attempting to contact a former board member. She tried to convince them to destroy an old laptop. The feds had already seized it. At the next town council meeting, I stood before the mayor and city planner as a representative of our newly reformed HOA board. This time, not as a petitioner, but as a partner. We drafted a proposal to require all HOA boards in the county to undergo annual independent audits, with the results publicly posted online. Mayor Ellison leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. "This is one of the most comprehensive reform proposals I've ever seen from a residential organization." I nodded. "We want permanent safeguards. This should never happen again to us or anyone else." The council passed the measure unanimously. Not only that, but the mayor agreed to allocate funding for a county-wide HOA education initiative. Workshops, online training, and a hotline for misconduct. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about accountability. Back in the neighborhood, people started doing something I hadn't seen in years. They talked to each other. Not just the occasional wave from the mailbox, but real conversations. Miguel launched a Saturday morning tool share program. Denise and her teenage daughter painted a mural on the old utility shed by the playground. Kaplan hosted a chess night on Tuesdays, with mismatched chairs and a thermos of sweet tea strong enough to wake the dead. I was out front one evening, repainting the trim on my garage, when Rebecca, one of the former board members, pulled up in her hybrid and stepped out carrying a small box. "I figured you should have this," she said, handing it over. "It's Lorraine's HOA binder, the original one." Before she started redacting everything. I opened it on the tailgate of my truck. Inside were handwritten notes, printed emails, and receipts that predated everything we'd already submitted. One envelope was labeled Confidential Special Projects. Inside, a letter from a roofing company dated over a year ago. The invoice had been marked with a massive cash payment over $20,000 for a community facility improvement. We didn't have any community facilities. Ruiz later confirmed the contractor had been paid to re-roof a vacation cabin in another county. It was registered to a trust under Lorraine's maiden name. That single letter closed the last gap in the federal case. At trial, Lorraine entered a guilty plea on 7 federal counts and 2 state charges. Her sentencing hearing was public. I sat in the second row, flanked by neighbors who'd been fined, ignored, or bullied. The courtroom was quiet as the judge listed each violation, pausing briefly after the final charge. "You weaponized trust," he said. "You took advantage of residents who believed their dues were being used for the good of their community. Instead, you used them to fund your own private empire." She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 6. Restitution was ordered in full, and her seized properties would be liquidated and distributed proportionally to the affected neighborhoods. The news hit every major outlet in the state, but the real victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the way our neighborhood changed. Slowly, without fanfare, but undeniably. We repurposed the old HOA office into a shared workspace for residents. Jerry rigged up solar panels on the roof. Kaplan donated a shelf of books for a small lending library. A local artist painted a mural across the side, a winding path through tall grass, with the words "This land, our voice" in bold green letters. One afternoon, I pulled out the last piece of that cursed fence. I'd kept it in the shed, not out of spite, but as a reminder. I sawed it in half and used the boards to build a bench at the edge of my driveway. It wasn't fancy, just 2 planks and some screws, but it faced the street and the neighborhood. The bench became a kind of unofficial meeting spot. People sat there in the evenings, chatting, sipping coffee, watching the sun set over roofs no longer shadowed by fear or manipulation. One evening, I was out there tightening a loose bolt when a kid rode by on his bike and stopped. "Hey, is that the fence bench?" I looked up. "Yeah." "How'd you know?" My dad told me. "Said you turned something bad into something good." I laughed. "Well, it was either that or firewood." He nodded and biked off. Later that week, a letter arrived from the office of the Inspector General. It was a simple thank you, signed by both agents, with a note that several of the reforms we'd proposed were being reviewed for statewide implementation. That night, as I sat on the bench with a cup of coffee, I watched the porch lights flicker on across the street. The air smelled like cut grass and cedar mulch. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler kicked on, no fences, no clipboards, no fear, just neighbors. And I knew with certainty that this time the foundation